Best intro ever. I want an award for answering emails. It's hard sometimes. They just keep coming in. People ask you more questions, and you're like, I gotta answer this. But sometimes they're cute pictures of dogs, and then it's okay. Anyways, let's talk about UI animation. You never would guess that's what I want to talk about today, based on like everything that's on screen right now. So animation is becoming more and more of a thing we're using in our interfaces. You probably see it a lot in the products that you use every day. You might have it in your product in a way that you like or don't like or are working on it, or whatever it might be. And I find that even though animation is a thing that kind of like lives in our design world and we see it all the time, a lot of us as designers aren't super confident with motion. And I'm on a personal mission, it's a very important mission in this world, to change that and help you all become much more confident with using motion. It's something that really, even if you maybe don't feel like you are a motion designer yourself, if you're designing UI things, even if you're working on a design system, you totally should think about these things. That's the microphone whisper. That's totally not a whisper. Yeah. So I end up talking to designers about animation a lot, like a lot. Sometimes like people that I work with at Adobe, or also just like folks like you outside of that. And I think it's because I wrote this book. They're like, it has animation in the title. You must want to talk about it. I'm like, yes. And they're like, oh, I regret this decision. I'm like, too late. And that's how I make friends. Anyways, that's so not true. You know how like things in your head, then you say them out loud and you regret it? I'm having that right now. So I end up talking a lot to designers about animation and just like how they work with it, how they don't work with it, their frustrations around it, and like what goes well for them, what doesn't. That's where a lot of what I'm going to talk about today comes from. I'm going to give you kind of a short list of things as far as like finding good purpose for animation, and then like a quick overview of how to make the style of it look super awesome. So you will all be able to fake it as motion designers by the end of this talk. Writing a book is also a really great way to make people look at pictures of your dog. There are a number of pictures of my dog in this book. If you were thinking of writing a book, yes, put pictures of your pets in it. That's what she really looks like. We're both bad at selfies, but she has the best beard. Seriously, she could like win awards with that. Anyways, back to UI animation. She might come up later. What makes good animation? That's the biggest question I get around UI animation. It's this idea of like, okay, I know I've seen good animation, like maybe people will have like some example of a product they use or a site that they like. They're like, this is good. And they're like, I've seen bad animation. I mean, we all really recognize bad animation. It's kind of like bad design, right? Like when you see it, you're like, oh, I can't unsee it. But good design often becomes invisible because it's just that good. And I feel like animation is similar in that sense. We're really good at recognizing when it's bad, and we're like, I don't want to do that. But then we're like, oh crap, how do I make it good? Like I know what I don't want to do, but I'm not sure how to define what I do want to do. And I've noticed that the really good UI animation, the stuff that we're like, this is good, has one, they all sort of have something in common. And that's that they combine this idea of purpose and style. They all have a reason for being there, and it's a user-focused purpose. Like a legitimate purpose is not because I can make things spin in CSS. That's not a reason, that's not a purpose. But they have a purpose that's focused on the user, and it's also done with style. And style in the sense that like it fits with the rest of the design, meaning that the designers have looked at what they're doing with motion, and they're thinking about it in a similar way they did with type or color or anything like that. So I want to go over a short list of really great purposes for animation. These aren't all the purposes. I could talk about that for literally all day, but then no one would ever invite me to these things. So I'm going to go over like the top 3 that people in workshops and stuff that I talk to find most effective. And then we'll talk a bit about style too. So one of the first purposes, or like kind of main purposes, or most effective, whatever it's going to be for animation, is this idea of continuity and helping people know where things are in an interface. I don't know if you run into this, but if any of you have like designed anything recently, we have a lot of screen sizes to deal with. We have like giant ones, sort of mid-sized ones, tiny ones, extra tiny ones, and you're like, how do we fit everything on an interface? We kind of can't. Usually we know, as the people designing or building a thing, where the stuff is that you can't see, but we're not always super great at showing people where that is or giving them that sense of the space that they're in. So animation is one way we can do that. And Cotton Bureau happens to be a good example of this. This is a pattern, actually, that you'll probably see a lot, or you have seen a lot, where they have navigation off to the, this would be your left side of the screen, the hardest part. They have navigation off to that side, and then off to the right side, they have their shopping cart, but you can't see either right now. But if you went to that like fancy hamburger menu and wanted to get to some navigation, you'd see it come in. Same deal with the cart on the other side, except it's empty. So they kind of Yeah, at least they have some empty state content there. But the idea is like when those come in, but the way they animate into view and then animate back out, that gives you a sense of where they live. You kind of create this mental model of like, oh, the navigation is off screen over there, just waiting for me to like ask it to come in, and the cart's over there, just waiting for me to ask for it to come in. And you have this sense of like what lives beyond the bounds of that screen. If they just had the animation, or sorry, the navigation just like hard cut, just show up on screen, you'd be like, where did that list come from? Why is it dark now? What's happening? The fact that they actually just show that transition in gives you all the information of where it came from, how it got there, and you don't have to ask any of those questions. So with these simple like transitions on one axis, they've basically reduced the cognitive load of using their interface by showing you where things came from and where they went. And like I said, we see that pattern a lot. These animations don't have to be super complicated to show people, like visually show people where they came from, where they're going, and create that mental model. Google does this too with Google Fonts, but in a slightly different way, a little bit more complex, if you will. They have a paint bucket up in the right-hand corner, and there's a palette of colors that live in that paint bucket. You know, because it works like this. When you go to the paint bucket, they come out, you can change color. It's probably very important we try the yellow before we go. Yep, that's yellow. Very yellow. And we get this sense that like that color palette lives in the paint bucket icon. Now we all know that like you can't put other pixels inside pixels. That's just not a thing. They are not a physical space in that way. But the way that little palette of colors kind of like scales up and like turns and goes back into the paint bucket creates this sense that it lives in the paint bucket. And suddenly we've got this like spatial metaphor of like, oh, colors are in the paint bucket. Cool. At least that's my internal dialogue. We can get even more physically literal with things like a card flip animation, which often get used in this sense to kind of like save space or kind of create the sense of like you can do one thing or another. For example, this is a Gumroad checkout, and you can either pay by PayPal or with credit card. So if you want to go switch them, it just flips right over. And even though like a card flip animation is maybe a little played out sometimes, maybe you think that, maybe you don't, whichever, it's this really great way of making it so the form always seems very short. It's very clear that you either pay with one or the other. I don't know about you, but I've been to some payment forms online where I've literally started filling out a second payment information because I just didn't, like, they were just not designed in a way that showed you that was a separate thing. So it makes it seem short and easy. And that metaphor of the card flip is like a really physical, very like a really easy one for us to know, right? Especially, or really only, if you make sure there's always the same thing on both sides. If we flipped that twice and the second time it was a different form, it would break the metaphor entirely and now it wouldn't be useful. But the fact that they kept that real world metaphor of like, this is the front, this is the back, which one do you want to use, works out pretty nicely. And I didn't record the end of that form, so for all you know, it just sits there forever. I never get the book. Anyways, a second place where animation can be especially useful is when we're trying to give people feedback about what's going on in an application. Happens a whole lot, happens in a whole variety of circumstances, and animation can be a really great added layer of feedback. Most of the time I've noticed like any really good feedback generally has more than one layer to it. There's usually like, you know, a message and color or something like that, so animation can be a great layer to add to that. Stripe does this in a way that Stripe does this nicely in their checkout form, where they're like, if you try to submit a form with an error or like an empty form with nothing in it, just kind of like shakes its head at you like, no, silly human, you can't submit a blank form. You can't buy a thing if you don't tell me how you're going to pay for it. And I'm like, oh, darn, nothing free on the internet. That's also not true. Anyways, and they've kind of gone with that very physical, like shake metaphor, and that tends to be one that gets used a lot. Not always in this exact, in that exact layout or that exact way, but this kind of like shake because it's an error is a pretty common thing. Possibly started with OS X years ago. I don't know if that was the first place it ever existed, but it was one of the first places I saw it. So having that kind of physical head shake tie-in can be a pretty great way to add a layer to some like negative feedback. When it comes to more positive feedback or ongoing feedback, we can also use animation to condense feedback like in time instead of spreading it out over space. So this happens on the same form, where if you go to either donate or pay, this submit button has many roles. It's both, well, it's more than just both. It's a submit button, it's the kind of like loading status indicator, and it's a success indicator all in one little button, and they do it with animation. So if you go to donate $1, you get that, and then you're like, yeah, you did it. Oh, so exciting. Instead of having like all these little like toasts or like modals coming up being like, your payment is like in process, it's whatever. They're just like, hey, look, all in one place. And part of the reason why this works is because they've done it where the submit button is, right? Like if they had done that up in the right corner after you click the button here, it would be nowhere near as effective. But the fact that they've put it in exactly the place where you would be looking when you submitted the form, you're like, oh, so clever. It's amazing how much design is like, ooh, that's clever. Or maybe that's just me. I'm like, oh, they're so smart. Oh. And feedback doesn't have to just be for serious things like buying stuff or error messages. It can also be used to kind of like heighten an interaction and make it seem like it's got more gravity or it's a bigger deal than maybe it might seem otherwise. So if you've ever read any articles on Medium, you can clap for them. It's kind of like this, where you're like, yay, and all these triangles come out and the numbers come out and it's great. For some reason, you can unclap, which does weird me out just ever so slightly. You can also reclap, so I mean, I guess it's all right. It's just a little weird, but whatever. But you know, if this interaction is actually pretty key to the whole like experience of Medium, right? If you write an article, you want people to clap for it. If you wrote if you write an article, you want people to clap for it. If you read an article that you liked, you're like, yeah, great article. You want to do that. So if this was just like your typical like kind of click interaction where like when you clicked the hands, they turned green, and maybe it just turned green once, like you wouldn't want to clap a lot, right? You'd be like, well, that's done. But the fact that they have little triangles coming out, they've made it sort of this like consistent feedback loop of like, yes, you're clapping and it's great, and look how many numbers that are adding. Like they make it more of an experience, make it feel like it's more of a thing, even though all that we're doing is like clicking on a hand icon when you really break it down. But it feels like so much more with the way they've given you that feedback through animation. And I did not unclap for Mandy. I left all of those claps for her. She deserved it. It's a good article. We can use it for something that's a little bit more, like, I guess, work focused. You know, maybe clapping's a little too fun. Animation often gets, like, bundled up in fun and therefore meaning not worth it sort of thing. We have a lot of animation going on with Google Docs. Dave mentioned drag and drop interactions earlier today, and I wonder if you've noticed how much animation happens in some really good drag and drop interactions. If we are in Google Docs, which we are in this screenshot, and we wanted to like reorder our documents, take a look at what happens. Got our documents, they got all sucked up in a pile. There's a 4. And then when we go to like move them into a new place, we get that like little color fade to tell us like, hey, you can drop it here if you want to. And then when we do let go of them, they all go back into 3D space. Very material. Oh, I'm so glad. Sometimes I say that and people don't get it. I'm like, material design. It's like at home at dinner and everyone's like, what are you talking about? What's wrong with you? So many things. But like this is actually pretty much the most complex animation we've looked at all day so far today. It happens in 3D space. Those little cards, those material cards, go back in 3D space. That's like crazy complicated. Not that crazy, but it's pretty complicated. And it all happens with you as you're moving those documents. And I bet half the time you probably don't even notice all of this is going on. If it was gone though, you would notice instantly that it was gone and you're like, well, what, this doesn't feel the same. But they've done such a great job at both timing that animation to make sure it's always moving with you and making it have just the right amount of information for you to keep you informed along the way. You always know how many documents you have, you know where you can or cannot drop them, and then you know when they're in the folder, and you even saw all 4 of them go back in space. Works even if you have 20. Try it when you go home. So it's really well done. Lots of animation in that whole interaction helps guide you along the way. Even works for physical products. For example, this remote, where it's like the best remote onboarding experience ever. And they're like, hey, just go and take it, it's charged, plug it into this other part, plug in the receiver and go for it. And it kind of shows you like these animations of the physical things you would do to get this remote up and running. It makes getting your remote up and running so much more interesting than any other remote. And really makes it like kind of an experience as opposed to just like, you know, random packaging that's like step 1, plug this in. This is a lot more engaging and actually a lot more fun. So that's feedback. There's a third thing where animation can be especially helpful for us when it comes to finding that purpose for animation, and that's the idea of directing attention. And Dave actually set this up really well too. I swear I didn't ask him to, but he totally did. He was talking about how we're wired to pay attention to things that move, and he was saying like if something moves in our peripheral vision, we're like, oh no, is that a lion? Nope, just a banner ad. Um, and it's funny because it's true. It's happened so many times. And I think this is part of why animation's often thought of as being something that's distracting. Because people, or at least maybe you work with some people like this, who are like, oh, we can't use animation. Animation's always distracting. It's always bad. And I think the reason people think that is it's because it's the only way they've seen it used. If the only time you've encountered, at least knowingly encountered animation in an interface is when it's like an animating banner ad that's trying to distract you from the article that you actually care about, suddenly you're like, yeah, it's always bad, it's always distracting me. But it's distracting you because someone designed it that way. Someone decided to make that banner ad animated, mostly because of the psychology that Dave was talking about this morning. They knew it would distract you, especially if it's in your peripheral vision, so it was designed to distract you. It's not the animation's fault it was being used to be distracting. It's just like by the nature of how it was used. So animation has a really big attention-grabbing power. Compared to things like type or color, there's like less gradient between a subtle animation and an attention-grabbing animation, right? Like the range between like a pastel color to a super hot bright pink, it's pretty wide. The distance between an animation that's subtle and one that's distracting is a lot smaller. But what if we used that attention-grabbing power of animation and paired it with things that people wanted to see or things that people cared about and not intentionally try to distract them to look at a banner ad of, I forget what it was, or something about like a coffee table? Was that your example? I don't remember. I just remember like there's like dancing bananas with mortgages. That's definitely one that existed at some point. Those have nothing in common. So what if instead we use that power to direct people to something that was important to them? For example, like saving their work. This is CodePen. If you've used it before, you know what it is. If you haven't, you essentially, it's a place you can kind of test out some code, HTML, CSS, all of those things. You write code in one little panel, gives you a preview on the other. But the important thing is like this isn't like a desktop editor. You're in a browser. Things could happen. You should probably save your work so you don't lose it. That's like just a generally good rule in life. But if you're sitting on CodePen and you're typing in a bunch of stuff and you haven't told it to save, after a while it starts shaking the save button at you. And you're like, doop-a-doop, type, 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 and it's like, hey, you want to save that? And if you're like me and then after you see that, you're like, ooh, what will it do if I wait longer? It starts shaking more. But I think there's like a third step where it's like, please save. And like, there's a bunch of buttons here. If every single one of those buttons shook like that, even like the minimal shaking one, if they all shook like that when we hovered over this navigation, we'd be like, this is horrible design, I hate it, I'm never using it. It would be distracting and awful. But the fact that they've paired that like extra sort of like bigger, more attention-grabbing animation with something that's important to you, like not saving your work, makes it feel okay. You're like, oh, thanks. I did want to save this. I didn't want to lose it. So what's making that work and be like informative instead of distracting is really the fact that you care about saving your work. You can see this on a slightly a scale of slightly less importance, perhaps. We see this a lot with like message notifications. You'll see it on Facebook Messenger and other ones. This one is in Stripe's dashboard when you're like looking at all the transactions you've brought in. If you get a new message, they show you a little animation like this. See the little bell ringing animation? It rings like once, I think maybe twice. Get a little badge to tell you have messages. It's not as big as that save button one, right? Because it's not as critical. It's like, you know what? Your message might be important. Maybe someone is like refunding you a bunch of money, or maybe like your credit card company wants some information. It could be important, but it's probably not as critical as saving. So like they've made it so it just plays like once or twice, and then it just stops. It doesn't repeat forever. We see the same thing with Facebook Messenger. When you first open it up, it's like, ring, ring, you got messages, and it's like, I'll just hang out here in the toolbar until you're ready to read me. So, the whole idea of like when animation moves from being useful to distracting is often very contextual and based on the context you're in. Also based on what you're trying to draw people's attention to. If you're using animation to draw attention to things that people care about, and they care about a lot, you have more room to like use bigger animation and bigger effects and still have it feel okay. So let's move on to a little bit of the style. And style is a thing. The style of animation is like just this endless rabbit hole you can dig into, and I'll give you like a hint of things today. But I think that there's kind of like, when it comes to how animation is styled and giving it a good style, there's kind of a base level of things around choreography we can do that's just like generally a good idea to do, regardless of what feel you want your animation to have. Like whether you're a very like stable and serious kind of feel, or whether you're like a fun and playful feel. I think all of these bits of choreography can be helpful to just making smart decisions with motion. So the first one is this idea of slowing down before stopping. which is something we all do in the real world. I don't know if you've noticed ever, but like if you are walking somewhere or running somewhere or driving somewhere, it's really hard to stop without slowing down unless something really terrible has happened. Yeah, you maybe noticed it, maybe not. Try it sometime, don't really. Please always slow down before you stop. It's literally physically like what you have to do. So when we see interface elements that do the same thing, where they slow down before they come to a stop, it feels like something we see in the real world. It feels more organic, it feels more familiar. It doesn't stand out in this weird way that you're like, why didn't that do what it would normally do? And that makes, ease outs are especially good for entrances because it's coming in at top speed and then you just see it slow down and it's like, hi, I'm here. Because it's just kind of like going right into place. You're like, that felt normal. Overlapping actions is like my number 1 tip for anyone who wants to look like they know lots about motion design, or if you want to impress any of your motion design friends. Overlapping actions is the #1 tip to do it. A lot of times if we have a bunch of things we need to bring in on screen, we might do it like this. We're like, look, here are 5 circles, one at a time. You're like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, got it. But instead of having each one wait for the one before it to be done before it comes in, if we overlap them, it looks so much cooler. So the only thing that changed between those two is instead of waiting for the one before to finish, like number 2 started before number 1 was done, number 3 started before number 2 was done, you get the idea. You get this nice organic arc to things. It actually all enters in faster, and it also just has this nicer kind of more succinct feel to it. Feels more like it's moving with intention and with purpose as opposed to just waiting for this whole list of things to come in. So overlapping action, great stuff, often even good for performance. Who knew? This is one that Dave kind of hinted at earlier today as well, this idea that things that move together are perceived as a group, and even things that move in similar ways. We have this tendency to design objects that are similar with similar colors, similar type, but then sometimes we just throw that out the window with motion. But it's if they're the same kind of object, they should move the same way too. Sounds so obvious, but I'm sure you've seen it done not that way many times. So if this is a photo and we want to bring in some thumbnails, we could do it this way. We're just thumbnail, 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 yay! Really obvious. All 3 of these little rounded white squares are all thumbnails. They all came in the same way. They all go to the same place. It's cool. But then maybe someone's like, oh, we need to add some interest and variety here. So let's make them come in like this. And the end result is the same. But the way they got there, you're your eyes kind of whoa. For one thing, you're kind of dizzy, and you're but why did one flip and one move? Does that mean something? Are they different? Are they not the same? And there's so many more questions that come in with this direction of wanting to add interest, where it's if you just left it the same and were consistent, it would be clear. Oh. So that's what happens. That's my internal dialogue when I see animation that's could have been good but wasn't. I'm just oh, if you'd just not done that. Oh. And then I pout for a while. So they move similar things, moving in similar ways. Along the same lines, having entrances that inform exits can be a really great way to set up that consistent idea of where things are, that spatial orientation we talked about earlier when we were talking about purposes. When things come and go in a logical way, it makes it easier to establish those physical places where things live. So if you have a modal that comes up from the bottom, it should probably maybe go back down from the bottom. Maybe. It can go wherever it wants. But when we do this, we get this sense oh, the modals live down below my screen, and they're just waiting for me to need them, and then they'll come up, and then I'll put them back down, and it'll be this great relationship I have with my modals. If instead your modal worked like this, where you're doop-a-doop, and you just miss it, and you're huh? It was there, and now it's there. Why did it go there? And it's kind of the same thing. It's maybe that's a choice you might make to make things more interesting, but in a lot of cases, that more interesting also makes things more confusing and kind of breaks that pattern of hey, if it came from down there, why did it go off to the right? And it's not that things always have to come or go back to exactly where they came from, but you want to have a logical reason for things. I've worked on a project in the past where we had all the modals come up from the bottom. If you dismiss them and you were just wait for later, they go back to the bottom. If they came up and you did the thing they asked you to do, you were confirmed the thing or whatever, they would go out the top. So it was still a very logical flow. None of it was random directions or anything. It was just if it was waiting for later, it'd be at the bottom. If it was done, it was out the top, and it was done. So having those logical flows is super useful. Matching velocities instead of durations is another one that's really big for choreography looking and feeling right. It's happening less and less now, but I still see these discussions occasionally, especially on Twitter, where people are like, I have found the perfect duration for all UI animations. It is 150 milliseconds for every single animation all the time. If you pick any other number, you are wrong and dumb. I don't know how they fit that in a tweet, but you get the idea. Because that's how you tweet things. Everyone who doesn't agree with you is wrong, right? That's just how it goes. That's how Twitter works. It sounds like such a great idea. You're like, yes, if you use the same duration for every single animation, when you open up your source code, you'd see a beautiful list of the same numbers. You would never have to decide if you needed a different number, because only one is right. But it doesn't really play out that way so well on like the visual using it kind of side of things. When things have the same duration, but they're going farther, so if we have a box that's going from here to here, and then a box is going from here to there that uses the same duration, it's going to have to move a lot faster to get there because it's going further over the same amount of time. So if you're matching durations, you get things like this, where that second box moved a heck of a lot faster. And again, we have that thing where similar things aren't moving in similar ways. But instead, if we get a little bit less hung up on the numbers, and instead of making everything the same duration, we just try to have them like kind of hit approximately the same top speed, like more of an art than a science, and we have things that look like they're the same type of object no matter how far they move. So even though that second box took longer, it hit the same approximate kind of top speed, moved in the same way as the one above it, even though the durations are different. And that'll give us a little bit better feel for using it. You're probably going to see some different durations on the back end of things, but I promise it's okay. So let's talk a little bit more into the details of style and talk about expressing personality with motion. Dave touched a little bit on expressing personality with like type and color, especially that, was it the You Will Be Mine one that went from being like cute and pretty to being like a threat? We can do that with motion too, but I'm gonna use less scary examples because that one kind of freaked me out. So how do we, motion can be very expressive, and if we have motion that's there for a really great purpose, but the way it's moving doesn't match our brand or doesn't match the kind of vibe of the rest of our design, it can just feel a little bit weird and awkward. We can get in those situations where you're like, no matter what I do, this animation just like really stands out and is super distracting. And if it's there, if the purpose is good, if it's there for like feedback or whatever else, and you like know it's there for a good reason, but it's still just not quite fitting in, it's probably because it's not designed in the same way as the rest of your design decisions. So how do we style animation? We do it through things like our choices of easing, whatever kind of easing we might use. We do it with our choice of like duration values. We just saw that in those last set of boxes, or if we offset things or not. Those circles look very different coming in one at a time versus being, just kind of having that overlapping action. And even the properties we animate. There's some sites that use animation but never actually move anything, right? Like in the same way that there's some sites that are pretty much all just like black and white or like use a very small limited list of colors. We can do the same thing with motion too. So my usual way for like kind of matching animation to specific brands or specific design personalities is to do little motion studies and to kind of narrow down. This is like super summarizing a more extensive project, but kind of figuring out what the brand wants to say about itself. Maybe narrowing it down to like say 3 adjectives. 3 is a good number. I hear 3 is, I don't know, really good for some reason. I forget why, but I've heard that. Some number of adjectives that might be something that you could translate to motion. And then creating a little motion study, but usually just with like some simple shapes. And I figure if you can make some simple shapes move in a way that has the right feel, that matches your brand or the feel you're going for, you can probably make interface elements do that too, because interface elements are often just a collection of shapes, not to spoil it for anyone. So let's say we were aiming for some branding or some messaging that's kind of in that realm of calm, soft, and reassuring. I've kind of picked some like 3 extremes of various examples, just to kind of show how we can differentiate these. So maybe we want to be calm and soft. We want to be like that like, I don't know, that life coach or that like yoga instructor that's just like, just breathe and everything will be fine. Or maybe you just want to be like that super like chill, like financial advisor or whatever it might be, whatever that personality is. If we wanted to do that with animation, we'd probably try to stick with some things like opacities and blurs and like small deltas, which just means small changes, but I wanted to sound fancy. Yeah, worked, didn't it? You were like, ooh, what's deltas? Just difference. It's cool. I think it's math, yeah. Oh, things get weird on Friday afternoons. I'm sorry. Then also easing curves with gradual speed changes. So, when it comes to easing essentially what describes the speed changes over the course of our animation, right? We could have an object going from here to there, and there's somewhere around like 50 billion thousand different ways it could get there, just by the way the speed changes might occur. We talked about before, like it could be going fast and then slow down before it stops, but there's so much options along that entire duration for the speed to change even more. Some will look good, some won't look so great, but there really are a ton of options. So if we go to our motion study, this is my calm, soft, and subtle. I use some soft colors too, just to really put it across. Maybe we do some fades like this. We're like, oh, soft fade, scale and fade, yeah, blur and fade, and then just like all of it. Blur, scale, fade. Except I should have said blur, scale, fade. Sorry. The voiceover isn't going, well, that's a whole other talk. And this is it in slow motion, which in this particular case is like very similar to what it was. Ooh, slow motion blur. I mean, you could just watch that all day. At least I could. And the same with a blur, scale, and fade. So everything there has very soft edges. It's moving in a way that there's not any super drastic speed changes, right? And there's even actually not even any motion, right? Everything nothing is like moving position. It's all static in place, but still animating. You can totally have animation without motion. Impress all your friends with that fact. When it comes to easing, it can often be kind of like, it's great that we have so many options, but it's also intimidating, right? Like when you open up like a brand new like Google Doc or something to like write that amazing proposal and it's just blank, you're like, crap. So if you feel that same way about easing when you're like, I can pick anything I want, what do I want? Which is a question I ask a lot during the day. There's some great places we can start. If you're working with something like CSS or even some various prototyping tools will have some defaults for you. Maybe like a default, for example, with CSS, ease in, out, and ease. Those are a great place to start, but if you want a wider variety, you can start with something like the Penner easing equations. This is just some of them, not all of them. And the reason I like them as a nice starting point is that they give you kind of a greater range and a more logical progression than some of like the CSS ones are sort of like 5 different, like very different versions, as opposed to things that kind of work in a similar family or fashion. So you'll notice that these curves change, like if you go from the top left to the bottom right, they change in a very logical way, right? If you're not super used to reading motion graphs, the key to it is that it maps the progression of the animation against time. So where the curve is steepest, the rate of change is fastest, and where it's flattest, the rate of change is slowest. So the ones that are super steep, when we get to the ease in, out court, that's moving real fast in the middle and very slow at the beginning and the end because it's flat at the end. And these start, if we had a perfectly straight line, that would be linear, which means no speed changes at all. So you'll notice that when we are over here in the sine section, these are almost flat. They're just a little curve. And they all have their own families, right? Because if you have the ease in sign, the ease out sign, and the ease in out sign, you can use those all together and you know they're going to look really good together. So that's why I like using these as like a great starting point, because it's not a blank page, but you still have a lot of places you can go with it. If you want to see them in action, here's a few of them. And each one just kind of gets a little bit more dramatic with its speed changes across the duration of the animation. So it's interesting because that ease in out expo, same duration, just different easing, feels like it moved faster than the ease in out sign because it had more drastic speed changes. Cool, I could talk about easing graphs all day, but we will only talk about them for a little bit longer. So if I wanted to do calm, soft, and reassuring, I'd probably want something with some small speed changes, which means something closer to a flat line. Not a totally flat line, because that would be linear and feel like robotic and just, ugh. That's the technical term. You don't want easing that feels ugh. So a little bit of a curve will give us just a slight, subtle bit of speed change. We'll probably feel calm, subtle, and reassuring. Something in around the sine family or the quad family, if you prefer quad to sine. It's just a little bit more curved. So that'll get you that calm, soft, and reassuring. What if we want to go like one step up in like, I don't know, seriousness or just like forcefulness maybe? We could go for something, maybe we're going to be something that's confident, stable, and strong. So we don't want it to be soft, we want it to be strong and like, not like mean strong, but just like confident, stable, and strong. Maybe you're like this really knowledgeable bank that's going to help you figure out all your money things. Or maybe you're just like, someone who is going to teach a really great technical course or something. That kind of vibe that you're going for with your messaging. So if we want to do that, We'll probably stick to things that have like direct movements, straight lines, symmetrical ease in outs, like things that like you could fold in half and they'd move the same way. You probably want to avoid blurs and bounces and overshoots because that's going to start looking soft and, basically what we had in the last example. So if we had things that are going to be strong, stable, and confident, maybe we'd have like things moving just a little bit faster, like a little faster in the speed change area for our fades. It's kind of like back in space a little bit quicker. Our scale and fade, similar to the one before, but a little bit more strong. And then our direct starts and stops, where that thing is moving in a straight line, and it's going exactly where it's going, right? It's not like overshooting, there's no bounce, there's no like wiggle, it's just like, I'm going here, and then I'm going there, because I'm strong, stable, and confident. And you're like, yes, circle, you are. Yeah, that's how it works. So we get that more confident, direct, strong feeling just by the way we've changed the easing and started moving things in a very specific way. So we wanted to get these kind of confident, stable, and strong. The easings we might go for as far as like the Penner easing equations there is maybe something a little more along the cubic family, which is a little bit more of a drastic start and stop, but still very symmetrical there, right? In that ease in out, like the way it speeds up into the action is almost exactly the same as the way it slows down into the action. You could practically fold that curve in half. It's like that's what the math does behind it, because it is. If we wanted to do maybe just get a little bit more dramatic, a little bit more of a noticeable speed change, we could even go up into the quart family, and this is a little bit more drastic too. Those usually are pretty good for that kind of confident, stable, strong feeling, a good place to start. These curves are totally ones you can either like use out of the box like this, if you want to. A lot of code libraries and everything have these built in. Or you could be like, I want something close to that, but not quite, and then go change it around yourself, because this is all with cubic Bezier easing that you can totally edit if you want to. And you totally should. It's so fun. So let's go like one more energy level up, and maybe we want to go for something that's like lively, energetic, and friendly. Maybe we're not so strong and confident anymore. We're not calm. We're lively. Maybe this is a brand that's like that fun friend that always knows where like the best new bar is to go to, or is planning like the coolest girls weekend, or whatever it might be. Like that kind of like confident, or lively, and like that energy and friendliness that's like a little bit more higher energy level, right? It's probably a case where if this is a feel you're going for, you're probably going to feel like you have more room to use motion, because the whole idea of lively and energetic, that just feels like a thing you do with motion. So we might do, for something like this, start getting into some overshoots, some anticipation, some snappy easing curves. It's in quotes because I made that up. That is not a technical term. If you go to someone like, give me a snappy easing curve, they'll be like, we all sort of have those vocabularies we make with our team, right? So if you've defined snappy, go for it, but whatever snappy is to you, just basically things that have like more drastic speed changes and kind of go from fast to slow really, really quickly and are a little bit more punchy. If you don't like snappy, punchy kind of works too. So if we were going for that, we'd be like, all right, let's do some overshoots. And overshoots is when an object basically goes past where it was going to go and then comes back. So it's like, hey, how's it going? And that's exactly what an overshoot is. Just like a little too far. Just kidding. It goes back. We can also overshoot scale, which gives us a little bit of a squishy feel. And anticipation is the opposite of overshoot. We can sometimes use them together. So in slow motion, oh, that overshoot is so dramatic then, isn't it? You get it. And then we have this one, just that little overshoot on the scale. Anticipation doing the opposite. And then both of them together, which is like a little dramatic to watch in slow motion, but that's okay. And we see anticipation and overshoots used together a lot, where often if something leaves with anticipation, it comes back in with an overshoot because it just has that like kind of extra little bounce to it. So if we wanted to get something like that, we'd start looking at curves like the ease in back and the ease out back, or ease in out back. And you'll notice something that's different about these curves than the ones we looked at so far. This one goes down below the bottom line, right? That middle one goes above the top line, and the ease in out one goes both above and beyond. So basically, if you have a cubic Bezier curve that dips below, it's going to give you a little bit of anticipation because it's basically going to go back in the progression and then forwards. And if you have a thing that goes, a cubic Bezier curve rather, that goes out the top, that means it's going to go past its duration and then come back. Handy. And any curve that does this, like these are all overshoots of varying degrees, like that one goes over just a tiny bit, a little like weird nub, and then one that's a little bit more of an arc. And you can make these in any way you want. If you go to a cubic Bezier editor, this one is cubicbezier.com, no matter which handle, or you can use both handles rather to create this overshoot if you wanted to. If you want to do it with the pink one, you're like, no, overshoot this way. And then you can just keep watching it. And depending on how you create that curve and how and where it goes over the top, you get a very different look, even though all of them are technically overshoots. It's one of my favorite sites on the internet. If you're like really, I don't know, just trying to make it look like you're really busy at work, even if you're not, or you just like need a break and want to watch some curves race each other, it's super fun. Just some handles, play some curves, and you're like, yes, that's the perfect one. If you do get a perfect one, you can totally copy and paste that and use it forever and ever. So yeah, this is a great site by Leah Veru. So let's go one more step up in energy level, because why not? And let's go for something that's like playful, fun, and lighthearted. Like going really out into the end of the kind of brand personality spectrum where, you know, you feel like, I don't know, I feel like this is probably one of the only ones where people would think they could use motion or should use motion, even though we've shown that all those other ones have perfectly good uses of motion too, and all of those can be reflected in motion. But this is one where you can have a little bit more fun, because fun is in the list of things you're trying to do. So in this case, we might go for those things, like those bounces, those shape morphs, the things that I said not to do if you want to be strong and stable, because they don't look so stable, they look a little fun. What we want. And also some squash and stretch, which is fancy animation terms. So if we wanted to go for something like this, our motion study might use some of these tricks. We're like, let's do a bounce. We've all seen a bounce before. Or an elastic, just like a bounce, but it doesn't hit anything. Morph, which are the most fun. Squash and stretch, also fun, but like harder. Like morphs are easy, and squash and stretch requires like skill, so I'm torn on which one I like better. And all the first two here, the bounce and the elastic, are also Penner easing equations. There's ones that get a little bit more complex that can't be done in cubic Béziers. The thing with at least all of these first three, if you want to get some effects like that, at least for the web, we essentially have to start looking to using some animation solutions with JavaScript, mostly because these use a slightly more complex easing than cubic Bézier, and you can do a bounce with cubic Bézier, just a bit of a pain in the butt. So if you use something like with JavaScript that has a more variety of easing equations you can use, or the easing math behind it, you'll probably have a more effective way of getting that done. Morph, you generally have to use SVG, and while CSS can affect the points of an SVG, browsers don't all agree on how that should happen. Kind of annoying, but you know, that's the nature of things. It will get better over time, but for now, if you want it to work consistently, you want some JavaScript in there. And squash and stretch, I did do that one with CSS, which is why it's a little wonky. But squash and stretch is really just this idea that if something is moving, it kind of stretches in the direction of motion and then kind of squashes when it gets there. Of course, there's tons you can do with how much does it stretch, how much does it squash. It just gives a sense that the thing is made of like not a rigid circle, but something a little closer to like Jell-O, depending on how much you use it, which can be, especially when it's really subtle, can be a really great effect for making something just feel a little softer and like more in a more playful kind of way. Squash and stretch done like really exaggerated tends to look like childish, which may or may not be what you're going for, but done just a little bit can give it that like playful kind of light feel. So that is my, I guess, like tour of purpose and style for animation. Like I said, way more you can dig into, and this is all stuff that you can define for your brand and include in your design system. But hopefully I've gotten you started thinking about this and feeling a little bit more confident about your motion choices and using it. So thanks so much for listening. And yeah, let's talk about this more.